on my list to show you everything today, David. So.
Okay.
Have more than one person that knows.
Right.
Yeah, I've got sound, so. Okay. Okay, so wealth and power being stumbling blocks in your relationship with God is something that we're really seeing in David's life. We can think of lots of other examples. If we think about King Josiah, who we're going to see later on, who brought these massive reforms to Israel, ultimately ends up his powerful position as king gets in the way, and he ends up dying because he doesn't follow the commandment of the Lord in the battlefield. King Solomon, David's son, just after this, of course, is going to stumble with the same things. He's going to acquire many wives. He's going to be the wealthiest, most powerful person in the world, the wealthiest person probably that ever lived, and that's going to cause him to stumble. And those are directly out of Deuteronomy 17, those warnings for those problems that are going to drive you away from God, that are going to cause you to stumble spiritually. And of course, Jesus brings that up in the New Testament, saying that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So spiritually, wealth and power can be incredible hindrances to your spiritual walk. David has a lot of struggles, just like you and I. He is the most powerful person in the world at this point. And that brings a lot of temptations and struggles with it. And we're seeing the consequences of his multiple failures, not just his adultery with Bathsheba. You can't be a perfect person on your own. David is successful in his walk with God. He's a man after God's own heart. We see that over and over again. David is successful as a spiritual man of God. But his position as king requires a lot of compromises and choices. And can you be the king you need to be, and be the Christian you need to be, and be the father you need to be? Can you fill all these roles to their ultimately in the way that you should? David makes a lot of compromises. He fails as a father because he's pursuing his role as king. Can you combine all those things in a perfect way? You can't be a perfect person on your own. So that's what David is struggling with here. Does anybody have any comments on that before we jump into this story? Yeah, it really does. Yep, we see all the exact same things happening today. Okay, so in chapter 13, we had the story of Amnon and Tamar. We know the story. We went over it. Amnon rapes his half-sister. 2 years later, Absalom, his brother, kills Amnon in revenge for that. And Absalom then flees from the presence of David. He flees to his grandfather, who was the king of Geshur. And that is where we jump into chapter 14. We start 14 here with Joab. Is a character that is heavily influencing what's going on here. And Joab is David's nephew. He is the son of one of David's sisters. And he's an interesting character. He just pops in every now and then. He is the general of David's armies at this point. And he is pursuing as much power as he can without getting in too much trouble for it. He goes against the king's wishes multiple times, but he never tries to directly overthrow David or his sons from the throne. He recognizes that line as king, and he merely tries to tag along, and he kind of works for himself. He does what he wants, but he's obviously in pursuit of a good relationship with the king and power. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. First couple verses, we'll read the first 3 verses of 2 Samuel 14. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, "Pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak thus to him." So Joab put the words in her mouth. So David is desiring to be reunited with Absalom, and we see that in the previous verse in 1339 as well. The spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom after he was comforted about Amnon. And it's a really complicated situation here, as we've kind of been seeing. The whole thing with Amnon to begin with is complicated. The less you confront the problem, the worse it gets, and that's what we're seeing with David. David should have known better about the whole Amnon-Tamar situation to begin with. David sent Tamar to go to Amnon when he was sick. Other people knew that wasn't a good idea. David should have known that as well, but he sends her. After Amnon's sin with her, David is angry, but he doesn't do anything about it. There should have been consequences for that. And then ultimately Absalom murders Amnon. And again, David doesn't do anything. Absalom, as terrible as Amnon's sin was, it wasn't Absalom's place to take his life, to murder him. And there should have been consequences for that as well. But David just doesn't do anything. So he just ignores these problems, and that just complicates them even more and makes them worse. If he had confronted Amnon in the first place and dealt with his sin with Tamar, then Absalom probably wouldn't have killed him, or possibly wouldn't have. But it just keeps snowballing and getting worse and worse. So that's a lesson for us as well. But in this time, it's been 3 years now that Absalom has been away from Jerusalem. And yeah, things have not gotten any better. So Joab knows that David really wants to be reunited with Absalom. What are some of the complications though? Why hasn't David done anything for these 3 years? Why might he not just bring Absalom back to Jerusalem? If he's longing for him, it says multiple times that his heart goes out to him. What's holding him back? I think we're gonna dig into it a little bit more in the story, and it's a little hard to tell exactly what all's going on. But yes, he has to deal with whatever he does is going to respond to Amnon's murder. So whether he brings him back but does nothing, or brings him back and publicly forgives him, or whatever, it's going to say something about it. So there's going to be consequences for that. But also, we're going to see in the story here that Joab presents, it seems that possibly there were maybe some of David's surrounding men were prepared to punish Absalom. So there could have been something there as well. But Joab decides to go ahead and try and bring Absalom back. He brings this wise woman. And I was looking into the word here, wise, try and figure out exactly who is this woman. Is she an actress? What exactly does she do? And it's the same word that's used many, many times for like the sorcerers and wise men that we read about. It can also mean crafty. It's the same word that's used about Jonadab back in chapter 13, when it says in verse 3 that Jonadab was a very crafty or wise man, some translations say. And so there's just too many uses for the word to tell exactly who she was exactly. But he brought her because he thought she would be the one to tell this story in a compelling way, to be able to lie about it and make it up. She was a skilled woman, will be another use of that word. But we get a little insight here into the judicial role of the king of Israel. The king of Israel was the supreme court. If a case was reasonable, it seems that anyone could get before the king to be heard. And of course, famously, we remember the story of Solomon when the two prostitutes come before him with the child. They both had children, and the one child was killed, and the other woman was trying to claim the other woman's child. And that case was brought before Solomon for judgment. And that's what we're seeing here. Cases were brought before David if they were reasonable and needed his judgment, and he would decide on those cases. And in that role, it seems that just anyone could get in the presence of the king to be heard. And we're going to see in the next chapter that Absalom, after he's brought back to Jerusalem, kind of steps in between that role and takes that over. He starts limiting the people that get access to King David, and he starts stealing the hearts of the nation in the way that he responds to the people's desire for justice. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we'll see next week. But this woman is able to get in the presence of David to present her story, which is Joab's story. So continuing in verse 4, when the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, "Save me, O king." And the king said to her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead. And your servant had 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen against your servant, and they say, 'Give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother, whom he killed.' And so they would destroy the heir also. Thus they would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." So Joab has crafted this story with similarities to David's situation. We see the one son killing the other son, and then a clan rising up for justice, and she's asking for a decision on that. So what's the purpose of this? What is Joab trying to change in David's mind with this story? Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting way he goes about it. I don't understand it. But yeah, her story seems to indicate some of the complications that David is facing. Because again, Amnon was guilty. He was deserving of punishment for what he did, possibly death. But it wasn't Absalom's place to take his life. And it's hard to tell because this is a made-up story, but there are similarities here, and Absalom's trying to use this logic Joab is trying to use this logic to bring Absalom back. And he says the whole clan has risen up against crying for justice against this brother that murdered the other brother. So possibly there are those maybe in David's circle, maybe in his military, that recognize that justice should be done, that something needs to be done with Absalom. So that may be something that's holding him back. Absalom should pay for what he did. So that's part one of her argument, is that this clan has risen up and they're trying to kill the other brother as well. And she goes on in verse 8, or the story goes on. The king said to the woman, "Go to your house and I will give orders concerning you." And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house let the king and his throne be guiltless." The king said, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." Then she said, "Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son be not destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." So this is the craftiness, this is the wisdom that Joab brought this woman for. Because David tries to send her away to put off a judgment and deal with it later. He'll send He'll send out his ruling to her after she's gone to her house. And I don't know why he does that. Maybe he sees those similarities in his own life right away, and he's not sure how to respond in the moment. But she recognizes that he's trying to just send her away, and she responds. She eggs him on with this declaration: "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house let the king and his throne be guiltless." So she acknowledges that this is a difficult scenario she's presenting, that the brother didn't have a right to kill the other brother, and that he should be punished for that. But she's saying, ignore that. On me be the guilt. You're pronouncing judgment on this situation, but don't be guilty for it. If this is a wrong judgment to let the other brother live, let that guilt fall on me. So that's her quick thinking on her part to bring David to the point where he pronounces this judgment, where he says, don't, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. So she's able to bring him to the declaration that no, this son should go ahead, this son should live. He will not die. And this feels slightly familiar to when Nathan approached David about his adultery. Nathan comes to him and he presents this hypothetical story, and David gets angry about it and pronounces that the man who did this thing should die. And then Nathan says, you are the man. And so this woman has gotten David to make a judgment about this hypothetical situation, this story that she's told, and now she's ready to tell him that he is the man. Verse 12, then the woman said, please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. He said, speak. And the woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid, and your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. For the king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the heritage of God. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. For my lord the king is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you. So she reveals that she's being intentional with why she's there. She's purposefully calling David out on Absalom, that he hasn't done anything, and she's proposing that he should bring his banished one back home. She doesn't abandon her story, which is still made up. She mentions her son and heritage, so she's still trying to stick to that story, but she's directly confronting David with his own story. And she just says that in light of her story, he should think about his own situation. And again, this is Joab being crafty. Her reasoning with David isn't necessarily correct. It doesn't mean it's the right decision to bring Absalom back. And the response that they're trying to get out of him isn't right necessarily. The reasoning Joab uses is that Absalom is an heir to the throne, that he's important to the politics and the going on in Jerusalem, and that he's more useful in Jerusalem, unpunished and alive, than he is banished in Geshur. That's kind of with the story and what this woman says. That's kind of the logic they're using. They also appeal to David's faith in God multiple times. They're saying that leaving Absalom banished is wrong to the people of God, and also that God doesn't desire to take Absalom's life, but that he will provide a way to redeem the banished one. Is there a basis for that? Are those reasonable arguments, or are they just making stuff up? Yep, pretty much.
We don't know if the high priest had died. That was the thing, wasn't it? They stayed at one of the cities of refuge until the high priest died, and then they could come back home.
Yeah, how did that work? That was if
Well, Well, that was if it was an accident.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if they were waiting on judgment. So if it wasn't known, if it was purposeful.
Obviously guilty.
Right.
Yeah, several commentators when I was studying last week's lesson, when Absalom fled to Geshur, like this in no way would have qualified as a city of refuge.
Yeah, it doesn't.
So
Doesn't seem like it.
maybe people stretch that rule a little bit.
And I don't know, was Geshur a city of refuge? I don't know that it was.
I don't know.
Because it was ruled under.
Right, it's a separate king. Yep.
It remained a small, like, one village kingdom for some time, possibly because
Right.
David's wife
Married the guy.
king's
Yep. Yep. Yep.
daughter, so rather than conquering the kingdom, it becomes that connection.
Mm-hmm.
So they were just kind of keeping him out of the way.
Yep. And they're pretty much just ignoring him, it seems like. David's pretty quick to pick up here, though, that there's a mastermind behind this story. It's too coincidental. And we see that in verse 18. Then the king answered the woman, "Do not hide from me anything I ask you." And the woman said, "Let my lord the king speak." The king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The woman answered and said, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant. In order to change the course of things, your servant Joab did this. But my lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth." Then the king said to Joab, "Behold, now I grant this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." And Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, in that the king has granted the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, "Let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence." So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. So David rightly assumes right away that Joab is behind this. And that's interesting to me. It seems that David knows his nephew Joab, and who is his general. So he spends a lot of time with him, but he seems to know him better than he knows his own sons and their motives. Right away, he knows that Joab wants Absalom to come back for the king's sake, and the craftiness he recognizes Joab is behind this. And I cannot figure out what Joab's reasoning is for this, because if we look at the character of Joab, he is focused on his own self-interests. He's not really loyal to David. He multiple times he acts rashly and goes against the will of David. Ultimately, David tells Solomon to kill him because of that. But yeah, he just acts in his own self-interests. I don't know what his thought process is here for trying to bring back Absalom, because he's also not loyal to Absalom, as we're going to see here just a little bit later. Absalom comes back and Joab ignores him, doesn't pay any attention to him. So he's not doing this for Absalom, and I don't see the benefit for Joab here really at all, other than maybe just to try and find favor in David's sight. That's the only thing I can figure. David's pouting because Absalom's banished, and Joab gets fed up with it after 3 years and says, "Let's just bring him back." But it doesn't make much sense to me, but that's as good as I can figure. Does anybody have any other ideas?
Almost like the relatives make it worse.
Yep.
The one thought I've had is it doesn't seem 100% clear to me if Absalom was banished or if he had fled on his own. And if maybe just nobody ever bothered to bring him back and he just assumed he was banished. That's the one part I'm not sure on.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, did he know he wasn't welcome to come home, or was he just assuming that he wasn't welcome to come home? And so Joab's purpose was just to let's go talk to Absalom.
It would seem to me that the fact that he wasn't sought out to be brought back and that he wasn't sought out to be punished. Those two facts combined, I mean, basically was banishment. Because he was pretty involved in what's going on here in Jerusalem, and for him not to be brought back into the king's roles means he's not wanted. To me, that's kind of it. All right, picking up in verse 25. So Absalom comes back, but he's living in his own house and is not welcome into David's presence. He does not see his father. Verse 25, now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. And there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. So this mentions Absalom's popularity, which I think is hinted at in the story that Joab presents, where they're talking about that it's wrong to the people of God to leave Absalom banished or left away. Absalom was the celebrity. He was well liked. He was good looking all the way from his feet to the top of his head. Kind of, he's the Jason Momoa of Israel is kind of the thought that pops into my head. He's very popular, lots of hair. He cuts his hair once a year, and it's so heavy on him, he weighs it by the king's weight. I don't know.
11 grams per shekel.
Yep, that comes out to almost 5 pounds of hair. Yeah. We were trying to calculate how much hair that is, and that's a lot of hair. I guess it must have been really coarse, really dense, but even still, I mean, that's a lot of hair, 5 pounds. But he would cut it once a year. And I guess that was what was attractive by Israeli standards at the time. Because he is the best looking man. He's praised for his handsome appearance. And his personality is very, very popular. And that's going to end up causing problems in the next chapter. But Absalom has 3 sons and a daughter who he names after his sister, apparently. He names her Tamar. And she is also a beautiful woman. And I don't think we ever know the names of his 3 sons. That's never recorded in genealogies that I could find. But he does have these 3 sons and a daughter. Going on to verse 28. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. And he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house and said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom answered Joab, behold, I sent word to you, come here, that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now, therefore, let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. So it's been 5 years at this point since Absalom has seen his father. He was in Geshur for 3 years, and now he's been in Jerusalem for 2 years and has not been in the king's presence. I'm not sure if David feels better about having Absalom living in Jerusalem but not seeing him, if he prefers that over him being in Geshur. But Absalom obviously does not. He thinks he's going to be, or he's still rejected by his father, and he thinks it would be better for him to still be in Geshur. He's also apparently rejected by Joab. He sends for Joab twice, and Joab completely ignores him. So he gets his attention by having his servants burn Joab's field of barley. And that gets Joab to come to his house. And he presents this scenario. He says, it would be better for me to be in Geshur. I'll just go into the king's presence, and if he finds guilt in me, he just let him kill me. Let's just get this over with. After verse 30, the Dead Sea Scrolls include another sentence that Joab's servants came to him with their clothes torn and told him what Absalom had done. but that's the only place that text is found. It's not included in any of the other manuscripts. And it basically is just a repetition of what we're told in the next verse. So, but this does get Joab's attention. He comes to Absalom, and Absalom makes this proposition, and Joab takes it to the king in verse 33. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So Absalom and David end up making up, apparently without conflict. There are no consequences for Absalom's sin. He's welcomed back into the king's presence, and apparently is brought back into some sort of roles there, or at least he takes over some of that we're going to see in the next chapter. But again, we're going to see that just ignoring the problem is not the best idea, and it's just going to complicate it even more. Next chapter is pretty messy because, again, David just doesn't respond to Absalom's sin and doesn't do anything about it. According to the law, it looks like Absalom was worthy of death. What he did was murder. He should have been killed for that, according to the law. But it's never addressed. No trial takes place. David just welcomes him back. And then Absalom proceeds to steal the hearts of the people and plans to overthrow his father's throne. So, does anybody have any comments on chapter 14?
I always kind of felt like, when he said that he was better off than Gesher, I feel like he had political motives. Gesher, he was the king's grandson. So I think kind of what he was saying there is like, I might as well go back to Gesher and start trying to get the throne there.
Yep.
If I'm not going to be allowed at the palace and try to get the throne in Jerusalem, because we're about to find out, obviously, he had massive political power ideas.
Yep.
That's a little bit of conjecture, but that's kind of always been my thought on
Yep.
why he thought he would have been better off than Gesher.
No, I think so too. It seems pretty obvious he was just brought back to Jerusalem and did nothing. So that really bothered him. Yeah.
Well, that also makes one wonder if perhaps that wasn't part of Joab's motive, bringing back so I can keep an eye on it.
That could be too. Maybe Joab didn't trust him.
That didn't do much good because they still let things get out of hand.
But then, yeah, because Joab ends up killing Absalom. We'll see. Joab's the one who does it. So, yeah, Joab wasn't attached to Absalom, but that is a possibility. Maybe Joab just didn't trust one of the heirs to the throne to not be in Jerusalem. Anything else? All right, let's prepare for worship. Yeah, what would you like to use? Yep. Yep, I can give, yeah, if you're just gonna stand at the podium, you're good to go. We also have the wireless if you want to go around, but yep, it'll be good to go just like that.
Good job. So, you got going home. That was quite a deal. Couldn't get up the hill first. Yeah.
She said it still wasn't.
Yeah.
So, let's try to